When you invest yourself in a fictional mystery that takes place across multiple books, seasons of television, or whatever, you do so with the expectation that future entries address your burning questions. In the case of the original Alan Wake video game, hardcore fans like myself have been waiting over a decade for those answers. And while we did get some, the answers we got invoke a variety of other questions alongside new mysteries that have been introduced. As a result, Alan Wake 2 might be the most confusing game that I have ever played. And this is coming from somebody who has not only played all of the developers' games multiple times, but explains complex narratives for a living. Nonetheless, the strength of Alan Wake 2's narrative, combined with a variety of spectacular set pieces, numb me to the pain of that confusion, and instead encourages me to further immerse myself and seek out answers. The best thing of all, though, is that newcomers to the Remedyverse seem to share this sentiment with me, people who know nothing about the established lore. Creating a narrative this confusing, yet intriguing enough so that people can jump in with the sequel, is both a surefire sign of master storytelling and a sign that Alan Wake 2 might be Remedy's best game ever. An easy Game of the Year contender. Now, with that mini review of Alan Wake 2 out of the way, let's get to the juicy stuff that we're all here for, the theory crafting. Let's review the answers to the decade-old questions that Alan Wake 2 gives us, and then reasonably extrapolate from that information where the story might go. Needless to say, there are spoilers ahead. Very quickly though, I do need to address an Alan Wake 2 theory that I put out back in May. After Remedy debuted a trailer for Alan Wake 2 at Summer Game Fest, I noticed a lot of people suggesting that the character of Alex Casey was actually Max Payne from Remedy's Max Payne games. After I explained why both characters were different, even though Alex is symbolic of Max Payne, I slid in a theory where I suggested that Alan Wake wrote Alex Casey into existence so that he, Saga Anderson, and others might help him get out of the dark place. Alan Wake 2 proves that my theory was false. The way I understand it, Alex Casey pre-existed Alan as an FBI agent. Alan somehow learned about his existence, I'm guessing through clairvoyance or writer's intuition, and made several fictional stories based on him. Of course, because the world of the Alan Wake games allows the written word to take on physical reality, the character of Alex Casey, the one Alan wrote, has some degree of reality to him in another dimension. Now, while the Alex Casey who is partners with Saga Anderson was always real, the question is whether or not the Alan Wake written character of Alex Casey pre-existed the books he wrote, or if Alan actually invented him. It seems to me, based on what we learn in Alan Wake 2, that neither Alan nor any other writer or artist invents ideas. Rather, all ideas pre-exist the artist. They exist in what Carl Jung would call the collective unconscious of the human race, and that collective unconscious takes physical form as the dark place. I will go over the clear-cut evidence for this in a few minutes. Now with that out of the way, I would like to review what happens towards the end of Alan Wake 2, with a focus on the big revelations. This will help set up my theory regarding the direction the overall narrative will go in the future. I will begin that review with what I believe is the juiciest reveal of the entire game. Mr. Scratch is Alan Wake. To be more specific, Mr. Scratch is what happens to Alan when he is possessed by the Dark Presence. He becomes what Alan refers to as a Taken, and what the FBC, the Federal Bureau of Control, refers to as a shaded individual, possessed by the Shadow. Which is, by the way, another Carl Jung reference that we will discuss more in a moment. For most of the game, the Alan we see in the real world was actually Mr. Scratch masquerading as Alan, only revealing his true identity when Saga hands him the clicker. Near the end of the game, Saga Anderson works with Alex and Agent Estevez from the FBC to stop the Dark Presence's possession of Alan. They succeed, only for the shadow/dark presence to invade Alex Casey, the real Alex Casey. The taken Casey then throws Saga into the dark place and runs off with the clicker so that he may fulfill his master plan of world domination. With Alan back to normal, he realizes that he needs to stop the dark presence by returning to his writer's room. Doing this will allow him to rewrite the story of Return, which Mr. Scratch wrote in such a way to alter reality and enable his evil scheme. Ideally, the ending would allow Alan to save everybody, but it would also have to quote-unquote stay true to the horror genre. This ending shows Saga rising above the Dark Presence's attempts to possess her. She receives aid from an anonymous benefactor in the form of the clicker and a bullet of light. Saga finds Alan, gives him the clicker, and he uses it to banish the Dark Presence from Alex's body. The Dark Presence then invades Alan, and when this happens, Saga shoots Alan/Scratch with the bullet of light. This supposedly allows Saga and Alex to be saved, but staying consistent with the horror genre, this was only possible with Alan's sacrifice. Supposedly. In a post-credits scene, Alan's wife Alice shows up. Prior to this moment, the game led us to believe that Alice had self-terminated due to Mr. Scratch tormenting her for years. However, Alice reveals that she is still alive, and that faking her own death was a part of a greater scheme to help Alan escape the dark place. We only get one hint regarding what that greater scheme is. Apparently, Alan can only escape his current predicament by either descending further into the dark place to the point he is annihilated, or ascend. Alan then revives from his gunshot wound and says, "It's not a loop, it's a spiral." With this quote, I will end my review and begin my speculation. I imagine that when people heard Alice say that Alan needs to ascend, they reasonably assumed that means he needs to ascend out of the dark place back into the real world. While certainly a strong possibility, I would like to put forward another theory that I believe is more in keeping with pre-established lore, something that would stay true to the rules of the Remedyverse. I believe that what Alice means by ascension is not to follow the spiral up and out of the dark place, but to improve as a writer to the point that Alan can anticipate the dark presence's every trick, to the point where it will have no effect on him. He will get to that point when he reaches the end of that spiral and enters the realm of archetypes, where he will become the perfect writer. A writer whose skill enters the realm of myth. I have innumerable evidence to support this, and I will start by re-referencing the Remedyverse's predication on the theories of Carl Jung. The first theory I mentioned was the collective unconscious, referenced by name in Control, and whose manifestation we find in Alan Wake 1 and 2 as the Dark Place. Jung theorized that uniting the minds of all living beings was an unconscious link. Within this collective unconscious resided what he called archetypes, the universal ideas upon which the world is built. Archetypes can be understood as instincts, as well as a psychological interpretation of Platonic ideas. To put in more simple terms, the idea of a mother is an archetype. It existed in the collective unconscious before that idea took on innumerable forms. In Alan Wake 1, we see the concepts of archetypes and the collective unconscious illustrated. An idea will lay dormant inside the darkness of the chaotic unconscious. It is only when the light brings order to that chaos that the archetype will take on one of its innumerable forms. Now, Jung believed that within the collective unconscious lies the greatest of all archetypes, which he called the self. To use simple terms again, the Jungian self is the perfect version of you, where you embody the highest ideal. Jung believed that one could technically, despite its virtual impossibility, achieve that highest ideal, but only by engaging in a process that he referred to as individuation. This process can be boiled down into two categories. One is a confrontation with one's shadow, and the other is a confrontation with one's anima. The shadow is very easy to understand if you accept that every human being has a dark side. In this way, the shadow is a universal archetype. Jung believed that within every person's shadow lies both the things that they don't like about themselves, but also their true potential. By putting in the strenuous effort to reconcile with one's undesirable traits and bringing them under your control, while simultaneously fulfilling one's true potential, one can embody the highest ideal. To illustrate the first example, I will use Alan and Mr. Scratch. To repeat, Mr. Scratch is the dark presence, aka the shadow, when it invades Alan. Like the Jungian shadow, Mr. Scratch has obvious undesirable traits, but also good ones, believe it or not. As Thomas Zane says at one point near the end of the game, working with Mr. Scratch enabled them to create what he believed was transcendent art. One can only do that by contending with one's shadow, one's unconscious, for that is the place where all ideas lie. If Alan can fully integrate the Mr. Scratch persona, his shadow, he will become immune to his corruption, while also reaping the artistic benefits of doing so. As for the confrontation with one's anima, the second side of individuation, it can be easily understood as a man's feminine side. If a man integrates his feminine side, he can benefit from all the classically feminine traits and the wisdom they confer. This is where the whole notion of a muse comes from. In Alan's case, he gets in touch with his inner anima through his wife, Alice. Doing so sparks his creativity. It makes him aware of ideas that his masculine mind wouldn't be aware of otherwise. In summary, if one integrates both of these archetypes within the collective unconscious, then one can achieve their ideal self. So what I believe Alan will need to do is fully integrate his shadow, Scratch, as well as his anima with the help of Alice. Alan will contend with both in the dark place in order to ascend to the realm of archetypes, of the self. Now the question that I'm struggling with is whether or not this means Alan will escape the dark place by doing so. I think what will happen instead will be something akin to what happened to the real Thomas Zane and his muse Barbara Jagger. Before I get to that, I need to confess to a blind spot that I had regarding the lore of the Remedyverse. While playing Alan Wake 2, I was, at first, under the impression that the Thomas Zane Alan was interacting with was the real Thomas Zane. But as the game went on, I found Zane's behavior to not be in keeping with that of the Zane we met in the first game, when he took the form of the Bright Presence and the Diver. To try and understand why this was, I brought this issue up to the one guy I go to when I encounter a blind spot in my knowledge of the Remedyverse, a fellow YouTuber named Gaming University. By the way, if you guys want the most thorough understanding of everything about the Remedyverse, you need to go subscribe to his channel. Anyway, I asked him about this discrepancy, and he told me that the events of Alan Wake 2 more or less confirm a theory that he has had for a while. If you want to hear the full content of this theory, please go check out his video titled Two Thomas Zanes, which I will link in the description box below. Gaming University argues that Alan never met the real Thomas Zane at any point, be it in the Alan Wake games or in the Control DLC. He provides multiple arguments for this, but the smoking gun comes from an alternate reality game called This House of Dreams, which took place during the release of Alan Wake's American Nightmare. This ARG took the form of a blogspot website owned by a woman named Samantha Wells. The final post on that blog was titled Diving Deep, and in that post, we learn what might have happened when Tom and Barbara originally disappeared into the dark place. It states that before they both dove one last time into Cauldron Lake, Tom wrote what he believed to be his masterpiece poem. After diving in, The dark presence and the bright presence surged up from below. The bright presence took over his body, and the dark presence hers. However, their souls continued to dive deeper down. When they were deep enough, Tom spoke the words of his master poem, and doing so birthed a pocket universe, one that contained an eternal paradise, wherein Tom and Barbara could forever live in peace. To Gaming University, this suggested that there are multiple Thomas Zanes left over in the Dark Place after his essence entered that pocket universe, a theory that has been given greater credence after having seen multiple versions of Alan stuck in multiple loops in Alan Wake 2. But in regards to my original point, this all makes me believe that Alan and Alice are destined to the same fate. Alan will go through a process of individuation so that he might become a master writer. After integrating his shadow and his anima, he will be able to write his magnum opus, just as Tom did. I personally think it would be poetic and stay true, quote-unquote, to the tenor of the Remedy verse if Alan and Alice meet the same fate that Tom and Barbara did. After all, their lives have paralleled each other quite closely up until this point. It would be tragic, because Alan would never escape the dark place back to reality, but it would also give him the peace that has eluded him for decades and also fulfill his life's purpose. He will embody the archetypal writer, his ideal self. And to cap off my argument, I'm going to drop one last mind-blowing detail. Jung believed that the most iconic symbol of this inner self was Jesus Christ, because Jesus symbolized the ideal man. Jesus was also synonymous with the Christian idea of logos, the Word of God, which makes order out of chaos. The same logos that God used at the beginning of time when he said, "Let there be light." As John chapter 1 verse 1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." The beginning segment of this verse is something we see towards the end of Thomas Zane's film, Nightless Night, when it is uttered by the cult of the Word, the cult that worships Alan in the game. Now there is still the matter of what will happen in Control 2, which no doubt will precede Alan Wake 3, as well as what will happen with Saga Anderson and how Mr. Door is involved, he's her dad. If you want to hear a discussion of that, head on over to Gaming University's channel. By the time this video is uploaded, he and I will have completed a post-game discussion about Alan Wake 2, where we will no doubt go into these and other topics. If you liked this video, please hit that like button. It's free, easy to do, and helps out my channel a lot. If you want to see more Alan Wake 2 lore videos on this channel, make sure to leave a comment letting me know. Until my next video, I want to remind you as always and as per usual, it's not a lake, it's an ocean.